You don't lose avoidant people because you love them too much. You lose them the moment you start chasing someone who only respects distance. But here's what almost nobody tells you. There are a few exact words that instantly change how they see you, without chasing, begging, or over-explaining. Have you ever noticed this pattern? The more you try to get close, the more they step back. The more you explain your feelings, the colder they become. And the more you chase clarity, the more confused you feel. But what if the solution is not chasing at all? What if it's how you speak when you finally stop chasing? Stay with this, because the words you are about to hear don't just change their behavior, they change the way they perceive your value. Before we continue, comment this: I choose self-respect. Because everything in this message only works when you stop abandoning yourself for attention. Avoidant individuals tend to respect emotional control more than emotional intensity. This means they are naturally less responsive to people who express strong neediness, repeated reassurance seeking, or emotional flooding. When someone constantly pushes for closeness, clarity, or immediate emotional answers, it can activate their instinct to withdraw. Not because they don't care at all, but because too much emotional demand feels overwhelming to their internal sense of independence. For them, emotional pressure feels like a loss of space. Even well-intended expressions like, "tell me what you feel right now," or "why are you acting like this," can be experienced as a form of intrusion. So instead of moving closer, they often move back to regain control of their emotional environment. Emotional control, on the other hand, means staying grounded even when you feel triggered. It is the ability to not react impulsively, not over-explain, and not escalate emotions when things feel uncertain. When you respond with calmness instead of urgency, it signals emotional stability. This stability is what avoidant individuals subconsciously register as safety. In simple terms, the less you chase emotionally, the more room they feel to approach without pressure. Emotional control does not mean suppression. It means regulated expression that doesn't overwhelm the connection. Over-explaining your feelings reduces your emotional power because it often comes from a place of insecurity rather than clarity. When someone feels the need to constantly justify their emotions, they unintentionally signal that their feelings require approval or validation from the other person. This shifts the emotional balance in the relationship, placing them in a lower position where they are trying to convince rather than simply express. In avoidant dynamics, over-explaining becomes even more impactful because it creates emotional overload. Instead of making things clearer, it often makes the situation heavier. The more words used to explain pain, frustration, or desire for closeness, the more it can feel like pressure to the other person. This can lead them to shut down or disengage further, not because the message is wrong, but because the delivery feels intense and repetitive. Emotionally strong communication is usually simple, direct, and grounded. When you clearly state how you feel without excessive justification, it communicates self-trust. For example, saying, "I didn't feel okay with that," carries more strength than repeatedly explaining why you didn't feel okay and seeking agreement. Over-explaining also drains your own emotional energy. It keeps you stuck in a loop of trying to be understood instead of observing how the other person responds. Real emotional power comes from expressing once with clarity and then allowing space for response, rather than continuously defending your feelings. Silence becomes powerful in avoidant dynamics because it interrupts the usual emotional pattern they expect. When someone is used to receiving constant messages, explanations, or emotional follow-ups, they begin to unconsciously rely on that flow of attention. But when you introduce silence instead, you remove the pressure and the predictability that they were used to managing. This shift forces them to sit with your absence, which often creates reflection rather than resistance. Silence is not about ignoring someone out of anger. It is about withholding unnecessary emotional output when there is nothing productive being communicated. In avoidant behavior patterns, silence communicates something words often fail to deliver: emotional independence. It shows that your emotional state is not dependent on immediate responses or validation from them. When you stop filling every gap with explanations or reactions, you create space. In that space, the other person begins to process your presence differently. Instead of feeling chased or emotionally crowded, they start to notice your absence more clearly. That awareness can trigger curiosity and even respect because it breaks the cycle of emotional pursuit. However, the power of silence only works when it comes from calm detachment, not punishment. If it is used as manipulation, it loses its grounding. But when it is natural and steady, it communicates that you are emotionally regulated enough to step back without collapse or desperation. Clear boundaries create attraction because they define your emotional identity instead of leaving it open for others to shape. When you don't set boundaries, the other person has no clear understanding of what is acceptable and what is not. In avoidant dynamics, this often leads to inconsistency in how they treat you because there is no stable emotional framework guiding the connection. A boundary is not an emotional attack or a demand. It is a simple statement of self-definition. For example, saying, "I'm not available for mixed signals," or "I only engage when communication is respectful and clear," communicates where your limits are without hostility. This clarity reduces confusion and prevents emotional overextension. From a psychological perspective, boundaries create structure, and structure is often more attractive than emotional chaos because it feels predictable and grounded. Avoidant individuals, despite their distance, still respond to people who are emotionally organized. When you clearly state your limits, you are no longer operating from uncertainty or fear of loss. You are operating from self-respect. This shift changes how they perceive you. Instead of seeing someone who adapts to everything, they see someone who values themselves enough to define their own emotional space. That contrast often increases respect because it removes the assumption that access to you is unlimited. Calm detachment is powerful because it removes emotional urgency from your behavior while still keeping you present. In avoidant dynamics, urgency often creates distance because it signals emotional dependency. When someone reacts quickly, panics, or constantly seeks reassurance, it can feel overwhelming to a person who already values space and autonomy. Calm detachment interrupts this pattern by showing that your emotional stability does not depend on their immediate response. Detachment does not mean coldness or indifference. It means you are emotionally aware but not emotionally reactive. You still care, but you are not driven by fear of loss or the need to control outcomes. This creates a different kind of presence that feels lighter and less pressuring. Instead of trying to pull someone closer, you allow space for natural movement. When you respond with calm detachment, you also protect your own emotional energy. You stop entering cycles of overthinking, over-texting, or over-explaining. This shift changes how the interaction feels on both sides. The other person no longer feels chased, and you no longer feel emotionally drained. Over time, this behavior creates contrast. Where there was once emotional intensity or unpredictability, there is now steadiness. And steadiness often stands out more than intensity because it feels safe, grounded, and self-contained. That sense of self-containment is what subtly increases respect in avoidant dynamics. Short, grounded responses reset the emotional dynamic because they remove emotional escalation from the interaction and replace it with clarity and emotional stability. In many relationships where tension or uncertainty exists, communication slowly becomes heavier over time. Messages become longer, explanations become more detailed, and emotional tone becomes more reactive. Instead of solving problems, communication starts amplifying them. Especially in avoidant dynamics, this pattern can quickly create a push and pull effect where one person keeps reaching for clarity while the other starts withdrawing to protect their space. When communication becomes long, reactive, or emotionally loaded, it often creates more tension and confusion because too much emotional content is difficult to process in real time. The mind of the receiving person may feel overwhelmed, not necessarily by the message itself, but by the emotional weight behind it. This is where misunderstandings grow. The more someone tries to explain everything in detail, the more pressure is created in the interaction, even if the intention is to fix things or be understood. Over time, this turns conversations into emotional negotiations instead of natural exchanges. Short responses break that cycle by keeping things simple, direct, and stable. They reduce the space for overthinking because there is less material to analyze, interpret, or emotionally react to. A short message does not demand emotional processing at multiple levels. It delivers clarity without pressure. This is important because emotional overload often leads to avoidance behavior, especially in individuals who are sensitive to emotional intensity or feel responsible for managing emotional expectations. When you respond briefly, you are not feeding the back and forth pattern of justification or emotional chasing. Instead, you are signaling that you do not need to overextend yourself to maintain clarity or prove your point. This shift is subtle but powerful. It shows that your communication is not driven by anxiety or fear of being misunderstood. You are expressing yourself once, clearly, without turning it into a long emotional argument. That alone changes the energy of the interaction. This naturally shifts the tone of the conversation from emotional pressure to emotional balance. Instead of a dynamic where one person is pushing for answers and the other is trying to escape the intensity, the interaction becomes lighter and more contained. For example, instead of sending multiple messages explaining how hurt you felt, asking for reassurance, and trying to make the other person understand every detail, a single calm statement like, "That didn't sit well with me," communicates more control and emotional maturity. It does not beg for validation, yet it clearly states your experience. This approach also changes how the other person processes you over time. Avoidant individuals, in particular, often disengage when communication feels heavy, repetitive, or emotionally demanding. Their system tends to associate emotional intensity with pressure, which activates withdrawal. However, when communication is light, grounded, and non-intrusive, they are more likely to stay mentally present. Short responses make your presence feel less overwhelming and more self-contained. Instead of feeling like they are stepping into emotional turbulence, they experience a calmer interaction that does not demand immediate emotional regulation from them. As a result, their instinct to withdraw reduces because they no longer feel emotionally crowded. They are not being pulled into long explanations or pressured into immediate responses. This gives them space, and ironically, that space makes them more open to staying engaged. It is not about manipulation. It is about reducing emotional noise so the interaction can breathe. At the same time, this method protects your own emotional state in a very important way. When you stop over-explaining, you also stop reliving the emotional trigger repeatedly through words. Long messages often keep you stuck in the same emotional loop because you are constantly trying to refine your point or make sure it is understood. This creates emotional exhaustion. Short responses, on the other hand, bring closure to your expression. You say what you need to say once, and then you step back. This prevents you from slipping into cycles of validation seeking where your emotional stability depends on how the other person responds. Instead of measuring your worth through their reaction, you maintain your own internal balance. That is a major psychological shift. It moves you from emotional dependence to emotional self-regulation. Over time, consistent short and grounded communication resets the entire dynamic. What was once filled with emotional chaos, overanalysis, and reactive exchanges gradually becomes simpler. The interaction becomes less about proving, defending, or chasing clarity, and more about calm presence and mutual respect. Your communication starts to carry weight not because it is long or emotionally charged, but because it is steady, intentional, and free from desperation. In this way, simplicity becomes powerful, not because it controls the other person, but because it stabilizes you. And when you are stable, the entire emotional field around you naturally changes. You teach people how to treat you through consistency, not intensity, because people don't adjust their behavior based on one strong emotional moment. They adjust based on repeated patterns. Intense reactions like anger, pleading, or emotional breakdowns may create short-term impact, but they rarely create long-term respect. What actually shapes how someone treats you is what they experience from you over time in a steady, predictable way. In avoidant dynamics, consistency is especially important because inconsistent emotional responses from you can reinforce instability in the connection. If you sometimes chase, sometimes withdraw, sometimes over-explain, and sometimes stay silent out of frustration, the other person receives mixed signals about your emotional standards. This makes it harder for them to understand how to engage with you respectfully. Consistency means your responses, boundaries, and emotional tone remain aligned regardless of mood or situation. If you value calm communication, you maintain it. If you expect respect, you consistently respond only when respect is present. Over time, this creates a behavioral pattern that others learn to adapt to. Intensity might get attention, but consistency builds structure, and structure is what creates long-term behavioral change in relationships. When someone repeatedly experiences your calm boundaries and steady responses, they begin to adjust their behavior naturally because they understand what is and isn't acceptable around you without needing repeated emotional reminders. Respect returns when desperation disappears because desperation changes how your energy is perceived in a relationship. When someone is emotionally desperate, they often overinvest, overexplain, and overextend themselves in hopes of keeping the connection alive. This creates an imbalance where the other person feels emotionally pressured rather than naturally drawn in. In avoidant dynamics especially, desperation acts as a trigger for withdrawal because it removes the sense of space and emotional freedom. When desperation fades, your behavior becomes more grounded. You stop chasing responses, stop overanalyzing silence, and stop trying to force clarity from someone who is not offering it. This shift immediately changes your emotional presence. Instead of feeling like someone who is clinging, you become someone who is centered and self-contained. Respect begins to return in this space because people naturally respond to emotional stability. When you are no longer reacting from fear of loss, your decisions become calmer and more intentional. This creates a subtle but powerful contrast. The other person starts noticing that you are not as easily emotionally influenced anymore, and that shift can make them reassess your value. Desperation also lowers self-respect over time because it places your emotional well-being in someone else's control. When that energy is removed, your interactions become cleaner and more balanced. And in that balance, respect is not demanded. It is naturally restored through your emotional independence. And when your words become few but your presence becomes steady, even the ones who once pulled away start to realize they didn't lose your attention, they lost access to your peace.